All right, thank you. So my name is Greg Bledsoe. I'm a recent hire to Accenture. I'm starting my fourth month shortly. I've been doing DevOps since before there was such a thing as DevOps because I sort of intuitively started implementing some of the techniques and the tools, but it took me a long time to really understand why these were so powerful. And it has to do with a lot of the same factors that have made the modern world what it is compared to what it used to be. And it's sort of the same evolution that IT is going through right now that society as a whole has gone through. So DevOps is it's my contention that DevOps is sort of the culmination of millennia-old trends in the most practical way available right now. And that's why DevOps is not only powerful for IT, but there's a strong correlation, a recent study found, between DevOps maturity and financial results in the market. I'm going to attempt to give you an explanation for that because obviously the question is that a chicken or an egg? I'm going to give you my answer to that question, which is, in one sense, purely speculative, but in another sense, I think you'll agree that it makes sense. So this first picture is of neurons, and a lot of what we have learned that has allowed us to achieve what we have has been from observing and describing the natural world. This is true for DevOps. It's true for society as a whole because we began to recognize self-organizing systems and emergent properties. And I'm going to take you through a quick history here that will kind of put this in the context of where we are in terms of culture. And you'll also probably understand a lot better why culture is so powerful, why it's the most important thing to tackle on a DevOps journey. So I'm not going to waste time redefining DevOps right now. We're at the end of DevOps week, and hopefully you have heard so many definitions of DevOps that your head hurts a little bit. So I'm not going to give you another one right now. Instead, I'm going to start at the very beginning, work my way to and we'll talk about DevOps at the end, and then hopefully when I give you my definition, you'll understand why that's true, because why is the most important question. So this is how we have always managed our businesses and our IT since the Industrial Revolution. And it's a version of much earlier cultural constructs that we have used to issue command and control in organizations. You can roughly call it vertical command and control. When we need our organizations to grow, when we need to scale it, we make it taller. Because once a manager gets beyond 5 or 6 direct reports, he cannot track or micromanage as effectively what each direct report is doing, and you then have to start stacking managers on top of managers. So you can get a very deep hierarchy this way. One of the interesting effects of this is that the perceived value of the work greater up the chain is higher. And so everyone aspires to move up the management chain. That's how they gain economically and in prestige. So in this traditional management paradigm, we rely on sending decisions up the chain for approval. The bigger the decision, the higher up the chain it has to go. Orders flow back down. That is a huge bottleneck restricting our ability to adapt, because you cannot scale that single person who's making every big strategic and many tactical decisions. It's a huge bottleneck, and it's probably the primary reason why large organizations cannot change rapidly, because they are limited by how fast the top of the pyramid can change. How fast the top of the pyramid can take in new information, can begin changing the culture, can begin setting a new example, can begin turning. That's how the ship begins to turn. It can be done from lower levels. I've presented on that before in other venues, but it is much more difficult than the person who has the positional power to start making the changes. So in IT, typically the top of this is the CIO or equivalent. Responsibility for different parts of the infrastructure is segmented, and you have separate groups managing different parts of the infrastructure. The infrastructure itself has traditionally been very expensive to build out and maintain. So to protect that investment and prevent waste, and its build out, the infrastructure and its build out is centrally managed. That worked really well for a long time. Because the past 50 years since there's been digital computing, we've done this essentially exactly the same way. It's the only way that we've known to do it. If we knew a better way to do it, we would have already been doing it. I think that's usually true. I mean, a lot of times people will say, well, why don't people just do it? And if it was so easy, they already would be. And this is because we've kind of boxed ourselves in with the way that we think about and approach these problems, because we've always thought about and approached these problems the same way. So we're at a point now where environments have grown much more complex. Different lines of business emerge, and it becomes very unwieldy. It bogs down decision-making and implementation at scale. Then you also have sort of this phenomenon where you have the hierarchical silos, where people are very disconnected from the overall goal. The overall goal for the database designer is not to get an application into production, but to design a database. He defines done when he's issued some specifications or a schema and issued it back up the chain to come back down somewhere else. Whereas a performance analyst, his goal is not to have value to the customer, but his goal is to analyze performance and pass that back up the chain. None of these people have any incentive to collaborate with each other. They will not be rewarded for doing it, and they may be punished if they take things outside their chain of command. So we have the problem of misaligned incentives. It's also true that this structure becomes very reactionary at scale. The response to problems is almost always to implement rules, processes, and bureaucracy to prevent problems and create predictability. What the man at the top of this pyramid needs more than anything else is predictability and a sense of control and order. Since he cannot know what everyone is doing, he relies on processes and bureaucracy and approvals and paper forms sometimes, check boxes, to make sure that everyone is staying on track and no one is doing things that are going to cost the business. So this has always been our default response. But the most powerful question we can really ask is why? Why is it this way? And is this the only way it can be done? The flaws in this methodology start to become obvious once you get a taste of agile project management, especially when it's done well. Because Agile is a much flatter system. Agile is a much, the project manager's job is mostly to remove obstacles to the project and also to keep things flowing smoothly by managing work in progress. So Agile starts whetting your appetite for something different. So here's the basic Agile concept. This was revolutionary. I don't think people really remember anymore how revolutionary it was when Agile came out. This blew our minds. Many of us scoffed and poo-pooed and said that'll never work. I was not one of those people. I immediately understood the power of this because I was trying to do this as a skunkworks project everywhere that I worked, to flatten out hierarchies, to get people to collaborate, and remove the bottlenecks, identify and remove bottlenecks to being able to get things done. So this Agile introduction, the introduction of the Agile Manifesto, was a culmination of many cultural trends, and it was the beginning of many more. One of the most powerful things about this is that it devolves the power from the vertical to the horizontal, empowering teams to act quickly without bureaucracy and approvals. They are empowered to do things that they have already pre-negotiated. So they have brought new things into their scope that normally would have had to go into another chain of command to be okayed. But we've all already decided that they're empowered to do things. So the big question is that this seems obvious to us in retrospect, that this is obviously going to be powerful. But why did it take us so long to figure this out? And why were the benefits not immediately obvious to everyone? So we're kind of stuck in this kind of thinking. If you read this quote, this is a quote from Sam Palmisano, who was longtime CEO of IBM. IBM has for a long time been one of the largest companies in the world. And this is what he had to say about what he considered the upstarts. You've got great companies, or you've got companies in great runs right now, the Googles and the Facebooks, good ideas, great returns, and then all of a sudden you need an Act 2. Well, geez, is Act 2 going to propel you from 30 billion to 100 billion? That's a little tougher. It's the Microsoft challenge. So you have to say, well, I need a different view. I can still create shareholder value, but I can do it in a different way. I can rethink capital allocation. Recognize where you are on the maturity curve as a management team and behave accordingly. Don't give a speech as CEO as if you just got out of Stanford and you came up with an iconic interface and you called yourself a piece of fruit. So this was a backhanded slap at Apple, which this is a good example of kind of a vertical command and control thinking, that at the top of the chain is where you're creating the value, and that the value is going to be based on what decisions the CEO makes. The statement is also an example of delusional thinking, because if you look at what market capitalization was for these companies at the moment that he made this statement, Apple had, 3 times the market cap. So Apple has lost more market cap recently than IBM's total worth, and is still worth more than IBM by at least two times. It's really a silly thing to say, to be critical, because Apple is well into Act 3 or maybe Act 4. So is Google and so is Facebook. These guys are not one-trick ponies. They are reacting to the market. They are very, very good at engineering. They are very good at responding to market changes very rapidly. So the sensible question for IBM to be asking is, what do they know that we don't? What are they doing that we're not? How can we apply the principles that are causing their success to our business? Because if you look at how IBM operates, IBM is perpetually reorganizing and retooling, laying off people with older skill sets, rehiring those with more modern skill sets, reshuffling their business. They're always doing that. There's a lot of loss and drag associated with these constant, huge organizational changes. And the reason for that is because they're not agile. They're not responsive. And you'll also notice that if you're having to lay off people with old skill sets who don't have new ones, these people are not progressing in their jobs. These people are not learning new. They're stuck in legacy technologies with either no desire or no ability to learn new ones. So there's many, many problems with the statement that Sam Palmisano made here. What is the biggest problem with this statement is hubris. Hubris is the idea that no one has anything to teach you, and one of the biggest side effects of hubris is resistance to learning. Hubris equals resistance to learning. That's a big takeaway that you could take away from this time. So past success can ironically be a huge problem, because the success, which could be just a happenstance, happy accident of nature, that you timed things just right. That's often true for many of the largest companies that we know. But the success reinforces the culture that's in place. And you're not properly attributing the reasons for your success, and your vertical culture gets reinforced. This is the case with most of the Fortune 100 right now. Once you switch your mindset from adapting to the market to protecting your market, you have already begun to die. Many large companies are being carried along right now only by the inertia of their past success. If they had to start over and re-enter their market today, could they? For nearly all of the Fortune 100, the answer is no. Now, one big counterexample would be Accenture, because Accenture is actually doing a good job of reacting to the market. As you can see, Accenture is pushing a lot of new information and training on us, Agile and DevOps and Lean, and making sure that we're thinking about these things, and making sure that we're adapting, that we're taking advantage of new opportunities, that we're looking ahead to where things are going and not just where they have been. So Accenture is actually doing a good job, not just in that way, but in several ways, of adapting to the market, which is another one of the reasons why I joined. So IBM, like most companies of that size who've been around that long, reacts very slowly. The market moves much faster than it did when IBM formed its culture and management methodologies. By the time IBM can finish a reorganization, the market has already moved on, and now IBM is perpetually behind the curve. There are tons and tons of the Fortune 100 that are still 100% dependent on companies like IBM and CA, and this inertia is carrying them forward. Not to say that IBM is dead or will die, but IBM will have to change, or it will slowly die off piece by piece. So large companies are notoriously difficult to turn and refocus. Now, if the Fortune 100 get better at doing that, IBM and CA are going to be hurting, because their legacy and inertia are holding them in place. So it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be that hard for a large organization to turn quickly. But why is it still so hard when we know all the things to apply to change it? I just gave you a pretty, I think, fair analysis of why IBM is stuck, and why many legacy companies are having a hard time adapting. So the question then becomes, if I can figure it out, and they have a lot of smart people working there, why can't they figure it out? And the reason for that is culture. Culture sticks us in a way of thinking. We trap ourselves in boxes that we don't even know that we're in. So I'm going to introduce you to a framework to start thinking about cultural issues and cultural advancement and different kinds of cultures. So there are several different culture models out there. One good one that Accenture has presented before is the Denison model, which I like very much. There's a lot of value in it. The Denison model is a very useful model. It's research-based. It's data-based. My problem with it, the reason that I'm not using it right now, is because I don't think it's illustrative of the advances that are being made culturally right now. I also think that Denison model is a product of the culture of hierarchical command and control, and so it doesn't really escape those. Whereas this model, the Lalu culture model, is basically incorporates Agile. It incorporates Agile into the organization. It incorporates the principles behind Agile, the principles that make Agile powerful. Because when you start asking the question, why is Agile powerful? Why is DevOps powerful? You start to get some answers that are uncomfortable for people who are steeped in these things, who are steeped in a certain way. Because if you think about it, if you spent your entire career climbing a corporate ladder, and now you're at the top 3/4 of middle management, and now somebody tells you that we want to flatten things out and we don't need as many managers, why are you going to embrace that? You should embrace that 100%, and I'll tell you why. By the end of this, you'll see why. It will benefit everyone. So my disclaimer on the Lalu culture model. Some proponents have almost a cult-like adherence to these concepts and see it as almost a mystical evolution of humanity's consciousness kind of issue. So I'm not a 100% subscriber to this model. I'm not a 100% subscriber to holacracy, which is kind of an attempt to create an advanced culture. But I think these are great tools that give us a framework to start thinking through some of these important whys that we're facing. So I specifically do not believe this is the next step in human consciousness, but I do believe that this is the trend in achieving efficient effectiveness in organizations. when faced with problems, the default for modern organizations is usually more rules, more processes, more bureaucracy, and I think that's the wrong response. The right response is to ask why and do things like blameless postmortems, which I feel certain you started hearing about this week. But to understand why that's not really happening, we have to understand the context in which these cultures have developed. So let's talk about what is culture. So culture is a survival mechanism where a group learns together a set of autonomic responses to stimuli that are often completely unconscious, but they drive our decision making and our expectations and our even with there are solutions we won't even consider because we've been taught that these are out of bounds. Now, this is very helpful in one sense because I culturally have absorbed the idea that murdering someone to resolve a difference is not acceptable. So this makes us all much safer. And this is the primary use of culture, is to make certain things out of bounds so that you are operating within the bounds that society expects. So organizations form inside certain cultures and have unconsciously absorbed these cultural constructs. The cultural constructs are more positive than negative, but they also keep us from thinking outside that box and coming up with new ways to solve problems. These cultural constructs have started to break down because of Agile and because of DevOps. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Another really important element about culture is that people in general, with exceptions, tend to be more risk averse than they are value seeking. So the first priority is don't lose what you already have. If you have to make a choice between gaining something new or keeping what you have, people will generally choose keeping what they have. So if you apply this to positional power, people do not wish to give that up. And that's a very difficult lesson as a manager, that if you want your team to be effective, you have to not try to do everything yourself. You have to not micromanage. You have to be open to the ideas that are being brought to you. You have to create a culture of problem solving, of how problems should be solved. So what does that mean for how long it took us to get here? And why, if you look at this chart, right, red cultures formed at a very primitive time, and it took a long time for that to get to yellow cultures on this model, and it took even longer to get to orange. Orange is a very recent construct. Green is even more so. Green is really still in its infancy, and we're already talking about moving now into a new culture model, what the Lalou model calls teal, which are self-organizing. The principles are things like self-organizing teams. Everyone has the right to help define what the roles are, and when you're in a role, you are the boss of that role. So everyone has a role, and everyone is the boss of their role. And I'm going to show you in a minute why this is the culmination of many, many different kinds of trends. So you have to, again, think about the context of this. Human culture first emerged in a time when life-threatening danger was the default. Language itself was primitive, and sharing information beyond a few individuals was nearly impossible. Power and fear were the concrete that held groups together, and strong cohesiveness around that power was often the difference between life and death for both the individual and the group. So over time, because people are by nature problem solvers, we started to solve the problems that were causing our safety issues. So over time, you start introducing improvements in safety, longevity, food production, information sharing, language. Abstract concepts got easier and easier to conceive, to communicate, and to share. Then we had writing. You had, from the invention of writing, from the invention of the ability to share that kind of information, civilization gradually started to emerge. The factors that drove the cultural artifacts of red and even yellow started lessening. So then we have an era like the Enlightenment. Then we have the printing press thrown in there. The pamphlet became a way to disseminate ideas widely. And you start seeing radical changes in society's self-organization. You start to see new concepts that could not have been conceived of before, like the rights of the individual, the empowerment of the individual. Fast forward and we add the ultra-wide collaboration through the open network of the internet. So what can you predict based on that? Well, you would predict accelerating changes to culture because the drivers of the culture are changing fast. The restrictions on culture that make it unsafe to not adhere to power are being lessened. So this is a really powerful understanding that I think probably we really should pay attention to. If we can get this, we can make some predictions about what's about to happen. Because knowing what is happening is very important, but having an idea of what's about to happen is even more so. And these are trends that are independent of all other factors. And I think you'll see why on this next slide. So on our x-axis, we have things like safety and longevity, the growth of human knowledge, communication, the concept of self-ownership, the exponential explosion of our technology. And I think you can see I've kind of mapped the cultural transitions in general, how general organizations are being run, to the developments that allowed them to happen. So red culture was a matter of survival. Yellow culture was driven by the need to cooperate, but there was still great difficulty communicating over time and distance. So very clear instructions were needed, very clear expectations were needed, and you couldn't just leave people to their own devices because they couldn't communicate back what they were doing necessarily very easily. So very clear job descriptions had to be produced. And these needed to be adhered to very closely. So we start to increase travel and communication. Free markets drive trade. And so now you have these market forces that are starting to interact over large stretches of time and large stretches of distance. And you start getting the exchanging of ideas. And this leads to an explosion of knowledge. And the explosion of knowledge helps lead to an explosion of technology. These things could not have happened without collaboration, without widespread collaboration across cultures, across, organizations, across individuals, the cross-pollination of ideas. Many breakthroughs have come when someone actually switched from one discipline to another because they bring a new way of thinking. This is becoming easier and easier because knowledge is becoming more and more available. More and more people are becoming educated. More and more people are learning to seek knowledge, and they're able to collaborate more and more easily. So there are two main trends that you are seeing are driving the culture changes. One of those trends is the ease of communication and collaboration. The other trend is the empowerment of the individual, because the more minds you have applied to problems, the better results, the faster results you're going to get. Two heads are better than one, and that is certainly true as population has grown and these individuals in these populations are educated and empowered. It is unavoidable that we're going to get much, much better results. So fast forward to today. Well, now there's another disclaimer here. This chart does not really account for the Dark Ages. We had a couple hundred years of setback there. The causes of that were things like constant warfare, depleting resources. And so we had a setback in communication, in travel, in communication, in the ability to collaborate, in the freedom of the individual, because wartime is a time when command and control becomes very important. You during war, you have to kind of go back to a red culture. because lives are at stake. Safety is not guaranteed, and the survival of the individual and the group can depend on those command and control structures. So the Dark Ages were a huge setback. But then we had the Enlightenment period. And in the Enlightenment period, we started progressing again. So you could pretty easily figure out on this chart where you could add things like emergence of society, the Enlightenment, the recognition of natural rights and private property, the prevalence of cheap energy, the invention of binary computing, networking, the opening of the internet, where another thing that has enabled us to get where we are was the widespread collaboration birthed open source software. And software has become a critical component of modern civilization. And open source has allowed us to really fast forward for all the same reasons. Open source is the foundation of DevOps. And not that the closed source doesn't have its place, it always will. But we would not be where we are today without open source, applying that collaborative model to software. Now, to talk about how our technology has changed, and not just in technology, think about how quickly you could design and then machine or create a metal part in 1817 versus 2017. So I can go down the street with a drawing and at the end of the day have a metal part that meets my specifications because there's a metal shop down the street. In 1817, who knows how long this would take if you could even figure out how to do it. There were very few, there was so much specialization, very few people had the knowledge about what it took to make that happen. Now think about how quickly you could implement a new computer program in 1967 versus 2017. I can have that using something like Amazon Lambda. I can have that available and scalable in literally minutes. So the barrier to entry in almost anything is so much lower than it has ever been. This is driving cultural change because the reasons for the cultures that we've had, the efficiencies that we've gained are no longer true. It's us that's struggling to keep up with that. It's us that's struggling to understand that. And we are the only thing really holding us back, the way that we think about it. So now we have lots of tools to invent new tools. The speed at which we can innovate and the freedom to do so, the freedom and ability to do so have increased exponentially. So another thing to consider before we move on to the next slide is consider that a primary driver of all this progress is our learning about, describing, and copying natural systems. Then we share those ideas so they can be examined and refined through collaboration. Two names you might recognize, Adam Smith and John Locke, as well as many others, the godfathers of classical liberalism and Western civilization, observed that very complex systems like human societies and markets don't require anyone to organize them. They are self-organizing and they have emergent properties. So remember the term emergent properties because it's very important. We will come back to it later. So more and more we are recognizing the power and prevalence of self-organizing systems with emergent properties in nature, as well as at products of human behavior and animal behavior. So cultural advance through time tracks very closely with the empowerment of the individual and the ease of widespread collaboration. The exponential increase in those has meant that culture is now iterating faster. If you look at the lines, you see that the red takes a long time to turn yellow, and the yellow takes less time, but still a long time to turn orange. And then green, which are, the Ben and Jerry's sort of culture models, which are less about command and control, more about empowering the individual, are very recent. There are examples from antiquity of all of these things, even the teal cultures. These examples do exist in history, but they are pretty few and far between. But they did survive and they did work, and in many cases they changed the world in a way no centrally managed organization could have. But we will get to that as well. So if you look at this and you consider this, so I would say that the fact that these things are correlated is indisputable. I would also say that when you look at the rapidity with which we are iterating, you can predict that we will iterate again soon or now. So I'm not necessarily sold on teal and holacracy as being exactly right, but they are ways to start thinking about it, and something new is definitely happening. Agile and DevOps are early manifestations of this change. So I mentioned that there are some examples of these kinds of organizations from antiquity, and I'll give you a couple of examples. The abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the Indian independence movement. One you may not even think about was the early Christian church before 105 AD, was holacratic without a leader. There was always a group of leaders. So it was not a leaderless organization, but it was always a shared responsibility, always consensus driven until about 105 AD. And in modern times, there are now ongoing experiments in profit-making enterprises that are consciously organizing in self-organizing cultures like teal, like holacracy. One example is Zappos. Now, Zappos is the bleeding edge. So they offered all of their employees the opportunity to leave if they did not like the holacratic changes in constitution-based management that they were implementing. And 14% of their workforce took the severance package and left. Now, whether or not that's a good thing depends on who left. Was it the bottom 14 they probably should have already fired? Or was it the top 14% who thought they could go be a manager somewhere else and make more money? We don't know. What we do know is that DevOps, which is a very flatocratic kind of movement, is deeply correlated with employee satisfaction and retention, because people feel ownership over the work that they're doing, because people do feel empowered, and they feel like they have some ownership of the purpose, and that's very important to the human factor here. These are also things I think you've probably heard over the course of this past week about these correlations. And that's not what I'm really going to talk about. I'm not here to sell you on DevOps. I think you're already sold. I'm here to start us thinking about why DevOps is so powerful, and what does that tell us about where the world is going. So another important point about these modern empowered individuals that are forming these new cultures is that they expect providers of goods and services to not only adapt to this rapid change, but also to push it forward. So do you do anything the same way you did 20 years ago? Or has technology changed the way you do just about everything? For me, I used to do land nav with a map and a compass for fun. And I'm not even sure I could still read a paper map. If the technology went out and I had to get somewhere new, I might get lost and drive off a cliff. But on the other hand, I also haven't gotten a speeding ticket since I started using Waze. So I am relying on technology for many more things, revolutionizing the way I do many different kinds of things. Many more things are on the way: virtual reality, smart glasses, HoloLenses. We're not even going to start talking about the kind of pie in the sky stuff futurists talk about, like cybernetics and neural interfaces and these kinds of things, which are not fantasy. They are reality. There are artificial limbs that are controlled by thought directly from the brain. There are neural interfaces that exist where you can move a mouse around a screen and push buttons with a interface directly into your brain. These things do exist. They're coming. They're a bit scary. They're outside the scope of what I'm talking about. So we're not really going to talk about that right now. But these are things to continue to consider when we talk about where things are going and the empowerment of the individual. We have the ability to, change not just our culture but ourselves if we choose to. Whether or not that's wise is a different question. Wise and inevitable sometimes are mutually exclusive. So again, it's my contention that DevOps is the culmination and acceleration of every cultural trend of human history. Open and easy communication, transparent process, the distribution of knowledge and power, individual empowerment, the economic understanding of the relationship between value and wealth, the lean understanding of value creation. All of these things helped give birth to DevOps and DevOps cousin, Agile. Learning how to focus on what matters means you have to understand what matters. This is not a trivial challenge at all, but we have in recent times been able to learn from the experience of others through the widespread collaboration of the internet, and we have an incredibly powerful example of all of these principles in DevOps, because what people are able to accomplish with DevOps when they apply these principles is simply incredible. 20 years ago, I would have thought this was magic. I would have thought it was impossible. Constant deploys all day, every day. Netflix stopped publishing how often it's Amazon stopped publishing how often they deploy to their EC2 and AWS environments because the lawyers told them to stop saying that. The last time they published it was it was a deploy every 6 seconds. But now someone from AWS told me that they are essentially deploying something 24/7, 365. Something is deploying all the time, literally every second of every day. Something is deploying. The environments created and destroyed with a push of a button, new concepts pushed to production and then removed after a few hours when you see nobody wants it or likes it or uses it. I would have thought that this was the work of advanced aliens 20 years ago in my career. And now these are becoming commonplace. Those are the extreme ends, but everyone who's applying these principles is getting benefit to their quality, benefit to their reliability, benefit to their agility and speed to market. And the simple truth is, more than ever, the truth that you must adapt or die matters to us because the pace of change is accelerating so much. The world is a complex place, and it is becoming more complex all the time. There are more variables to consider. Everyone has access to almost all the same information to make decisions. And so the complexity of the things to which we must respond has grown exponentially as well. The business environment has exponentially increased in complexity. So this is someone's attempt to make a complexity map of one market in Ireland. I believe it is the market for eggs. And so this does not even take into account globalization. This is only what the factors are that are inside Ireland. But there are countless pressures that come from outside Ireland: imports, exports, monetary policy, millions of things that you would never think of. The weather, global weather, right? Because the weather in other parts of the world are going to affect the market, which will in the end affect Ireland, driving prices up or down and put their chicken farmers in or out of business. So no one can hold this in their head. It's also now true that the way that we have traditionally budgeted things will no longer work. We make a budgetary assumption about what's going to happen in the next fiscal year, 365 days away. By the time we get to the end of that year, all of our assumptions are likely to be completely irrelevant. Large capital expenditures that require 3-year justifications are very risky because a year from now you may discover that the whole project was worthless and provides no value. It's a very different world. So what are we then to do? How are we to adapt to this? No one person can possibly respond quick enough and set strategy quick enough to adapt to all these changes. So what's our hope? How do we adjust to this reality? So here's a quote I read by a man named Nassim Nicholas Taleb in, interestingly enough, the Hindu.com. It was an interview that he did there. And I don't believe that he is a Hindu. So it's a very diverse interview where they were discussing political trends like Brexit, the kind of recent overthrow of the political establishment in the U.S., and the kind of pangs that that's causing. And this was a comment that he made about it at the end of the interview. Where do you see the world moving now? Further left, further right, or will it revert to the center? And his comment, I think, is very, very profound. It will not go left or right, and I don't know about the short term, but in the long term, the world can only survive if it lives like nature does. Many smaller units of governance and a collection of super islands with some separation, quick decision-making, and visible implementation or transparency. So in this article, he is talking about expanding on ideas he's written about in some length, which I recommend you look at. He contends that there is a global riot against experts, which he almost always calls pseudo-experts, because their access to information does not really exceed the general populace anymore. You can go on PubMed and learn anything you want to know. You can go on literally you can type into a box and seconds later have millions of results allowing you to learn anything you want to learn. The value of expertise has dropped dramatically. The need to have experts kind of informing aristocrats to make decisions for everyone is almost no longer a factor at all, due to the empowerment of the individual, the widespread sharing of knowledge and collaboration. So the legacy idea from the yellow and orange age that information was difficult to acquire, it was difficult to disseminate, therefore centralizing decision-making by those with the most access to information and ability to respond effectively to that information, whether you attribute that to education, experience, breeding, or whatever reasons you attribute those to, they saw that as the only viable solution because disseminating the information through the entire group was impossible. But none of those assumptions hold true anymore. None of those cultural drivers are true anymore. So here's a metaphor that might be slightly offensive, but it's also, I think, pretty profound. So experts are the new priestly caste, and executives are the modern aristocracy in the business world. Now, you can apply this same metaphor to politics, to any other subject area, and you can reach all the same conclusions. Not that we need to do away with experts and expertise or executives, but that we have to acknowledge that a handful of experts or executives several levels removed from what's actually happening on the ground simply cannot understand or respond as effectively or as quickly to the rapidly changing world as the combined wisdom of all the independent actors that make up the systems and the emergent properties of those systems. This is a basic insight of Adam Smith, that these things have a logic of their own that they follow, and each person pursuing their own interests and handling the things that are in their sphere of responsibility create a level of efficiency that you cannot centrally manage. And that was true then. It's even more true now. And this is what we're seeing, and this is why we're seeing a movement towards flatocracy, because as much as some people believe otherwise, these things are becoming self-evident truths. So how then can we become agile enough to respond to these changes at scale? And how can we both respond to changes and scale at the same time, since we know that just stacking managers in a vertical alignment doesn't work? So we have to do what Adam Smith and John Locke did and take a page from nature and what Dr. Taleb has recommended, and take a page from nature's book. So the deeper we look into nature and emergent systems, emergent properties of systems, the more we understand that we don't really know much about it. Think of an ant colony. Ant colony has no central command and control. Each ant acts on a very simple instinct in response to a limited set of stimuli, yet the emergent behavior of the colony is incredibly complex and efficient. As a result, ants are one of the most extremely successful organisms on the planet. They make up a significant percentage of Earth's biomass. Now think about the complexity of a human being. This dwarfs the complexity of the ant colony. The deeper we look into how we work, the more we realize we don't understand. A supercomputer cannot feasibly model the chemical reactions in one cell for 1 second in the lifetime of the universe. We can barely predict how or why any given protein assembled by RNA will fold, which is only one tiny portion of what's happening in a cell, and millions of these proteins are being created and folded and destroyed simultaneously all the time in every cell. We have now learned that traits influenced by environment are in fact heritable through epigenetics, that the methylation that regulates particular genes are influenced by environment, experience, and even psychology, so that emotional trauma can impact offspring that are born years later. We've also recently discovered that DNA from the food you eat is expressed in your cells after you eat it. For instance, rice will modify the way you metabolize cholesterol in ways we don't understand for some number of hours after you eat it. You can also consider yourself a superorganism that's made up of over 100 trillion cells that make up you, that are not you. Instead, they're sympathetic organisms that you depend on to help produce B vitamins and regulate your immune system in ways that we still don't really understand. A human being and human consciousness are emergent from the layering of innumerable self-organizing semi-random systems. There is no central organization that tells cells what kind of cells to become or what proteins to make, yet they all interact and are influenced by each other. And the emergent property of a human being is resilient, adaptive, self-healing, capable of improving itself and adapting to diverse environments by conscious will. Is this not exactly what we want for our own organizations? If we do, then we have to go about this the same way that the human organism does. So what does all this have to do with DevOps? Flatter, more holocratic models are designed to achieve these emergent properties by unleashing the power of collaboration and empowerment. Faster reaction by eliminating bottlenecks in decision-making, less discriminatory filtering that discards good ideas as well as bad, allowing for cheaper execution of many ideas in parallel. So that sounds a lot like DevOps, doesn't it? These are very convergent trends. Now, why do I say DevOps changes everything? Because I'm saying that DevOps is the result of everything changing. So remember that the original problem DevOps was designed to solve was a lack of incentive to collaborate, producing loss of knowledge and perspective, which introduced inefficiency and delay. What we didn't know yet was just how powerful combining this with ultra-wide scale collaboration would be. Originally, all I wanted to do was help the devs stop breaking things with simple mistakes like committing local configurations that would then break test environments. There was no continuous integration, much less continuous deployment. But we started learning from each other and sharing perspectives. We brought an ops mentality to development, and we brought a programmatic algorithmic automation perspective to ops. The result was continuous integration. Once we got into where we could do 10,000 successful builds in a row that we then could take to production without any further intervention, why do we need the human being hitting the button anymore? Now we've invented continuous delivery, and we started automating all our testing in between. We attended the conferences, we shared our experiences, and we built new tools. We published our results, and soon we were doing amazing things like infrastructure as code and software-defined networking. We open sourced not just the tools, but the methodology itself, the way of looking at IT and managing infrastructure. We learned much more deeply about lean, agile, continuous learning, and continuous improvement culture, or Kaizen. We were converts because we immediately saw their power when we applied this thinking and methodology to our problems. Not just the tools, it's the way of thinking and the methodology and the empowerment and the collaboration all together. It's magic. The pace of change is still accelerating because we empowered the individuals and widely collaborated on how to take advantage of the deflationary boom in computing and networking technology to compound the rapidity with which we can explore ideas and iterate change. So in other words, DevOps itself. We apply DevOps principles to DevOps. Continuous learning and continuous improvement drive us forward. When we started using the term DevOps, we didn't have continuous integration. We just wanted to answer the question as quickly as possible, will it build? But we didn't stop there. We went through continuous delivery to infrastructure as a service, to platform as a service, and then to operations as a service. Now, what does this teach us? I'm going to give you a principle. From experience, we derive principles. From principles, we extract strategies. From strategies, we develop tactics. To implement tactics, we create tools. The tools give us new experiences from which we derive new principles. And then the cycle continues over and over and on and on. And this is why I contend DevOps is the latest expression of cultural and technological changes that have been accelerating for millennia. The same things that make DevOps powerful are the drivers that make societies prosperous and people content. And they have accelerated our change of human culture. So once you see the power of this, DevOps changes everything. Once you get this into an organization, the power of it is obvious. The power of collaboration, automation, lean systems thinking, reliability engineering that we learn through our collaboration in the DevOps movement. They empower not only agility through rapid iterative release, but quality and reliability. And then people have to start thinking about, why does this work? And why should these ideas be limited to IT? Once you start to comprehend the answer, you can never go back. You've jumped outside the cultural box. Then you realize that to respond to the changing world, you must start devolving decision-making power downward through the organization. You must stop managing your infrastructure server by server, manually, network by network. You must adopt software-defined networking, and you must adopt automated technologies. You must do infrastructure as code. You must. But once you see the power of that, you start wondering why you aren't doing that in the rest of your organization. You've now passed the point of no return. We at Accenture have the opportunity to embed in every level of every client to coach them through these transformations if we understand it and they don't. If we have thought these through and they haven't, then they are going to need our coaching. Now, Accenture is ahead of the curve. My experience with Accenture is that Accenture is moving into a green type organization. I didn't really have time to really talk about what a green organization looks like, but that is really what organizing around shared values, organizing around shared mission is really what Accenture is attempting to do and doing it well. And I believe that Accenture is going to become more flatocratic, more holocratic, and more teal, a more teal culture all the time. Because I believe that at the higher levels, these trends are being implemented, they are understood, they are being implemented. You can see the evidence every day, and we're taking an evolutionary, not a revolutionary approach. You don't change everything in a day, but you apply the principles of continuous learning and continuous improvement, which means that you make small changes every day instead of trying to make a big change. And this is going to continue to happen. Now, we may not wind up at something that looks like a holocratic organization. It may look very different. It's very difficult to say because as people are trying to implement these, we'll see what happens and we'll learn. We'll collaborate about the results. We'll try something different. We will be the researchers. We will be the scientists that will be able to accumulate this knowledge and information that will take us forward. So that's my time. I was going to try to leave about 15 minutes for questions and answers. I obviously did not make it. I never do. I always run over. As you can tell, I like to talk about a lot of different things. And so at the end, I'm supposed to tell you about the open house session, that you can bring your feedback. And this is another one of those critically important things that people think is just a checkbox, but it's not. We in the DevOps architecture practice, we need your feedback about what are you seeing. You are in the clients that we're not. You're seeing them from a perspective that we're not. And so how to bring maximum value to our client is going to be very dependent on what you're seeing, what you're trying, what you're doing, and you taking these ideas back to your clients. I think that it's critically important, again, that you guys start investigating. Everyone at Accenture needs to start paying attention to these trends, needs to start paying attention to these models, needs to start thinking through cultural issues, because the cultural issues are by far the biggest drivers of success and failure, because they define the box in which you can think or not. So we do have maybe 1 minute, if anyone has a quick question. And if not, then thank you for your time, and I hope that you can take these ideas and build on them.
I'm sorry, Greg. I have just a little question, if you don't mind.
Please.
How do you deal with the mindset of the business that don't want to change?
So you can't force change, cultural change, on people that don't want it. So this is where the power of your individual choice will come in. You can choose to go to a different client, right? You have power over your own choice. If you would like to work in a client that wants change, make it happen. Talk to the client teams from other clients. Find ones that want to do DevOps transformations, because the ones that do are going to succeed, and the ones that don't are not. That's the bottom line. You may not see those in the short term for various reasons, but you will see them in the long term. So that's my time. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.